In this news roundup of the week for 19th of August 2022, the UK government identifies causes for the surge in excess deaths, which for 2022 could be killing more people than COVID. Liz Cheney loses her election and Sam Harris goes viral in a bad way, all in the name of keeping Trump out of the White House. Russia begins the process of wiping out national cultural identity in the areas it occupies in Ukraine. And in this week's Short Thought, I reflect on the free speech questions hanging in the air after the attack on Salman Rushdie. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Over the last couple of weeks in the UK, we've had the news that COVID cases, having had a summer spike, are now falling pretty fast. That summer spike has had relatively little attention from the media compared to the blanket coverage of previous waves, but it certainly has been widespread. Just to throw in some totally anecdotal, statistically invalid information, no previous wave seems to have ripped through quite so many of my own friends and neighbours as this one has. Quite a few had a horrible time with it. Nobody in hospital, so that's as much as you would hope for. I mean, if there have to be endemic diseases in the world, and it seems like there have to be, then it being a hazard that can give you a crappy week unless you're really unlucky, that is what you would expect. Not everyone's ready to embrace the new normal though. Tony Blair's Institute for Global Change called on the UK government this week to consider mandatory mask wearing on public transport and most indoor public venues. It's a call that seems unlikely to get much of a hearing from the new government, since both of the candidates for leader seem inclined to push back against heavy-handed government requirements on such things. They'll probably be encouraged in that view by the continuing and growing awareness of the current death toll from conditions other than COVID. Now, I covered this recently, and this week it was revealed that the Department of Health has finally ordered an investigation into what's happening. The latest figures from the Office for National Statistics showed that excess deaths are currently 14.4% higher than the 5-year average. In this graph, the blue area is deaths from COVID, the red is non-COVID deaths. In total, 1,350 more deaths than usual in the week ending August the 5th. Dr. Charles Levinson, the head of a private GP service, told the Daily Telegraph that his company was seeing larger than usual cases of undetected cancers and cardiac problems, as well as what he called disturbing numbers of mental health conditions. The Department of Health said that its information is that the majority of cases are linked to largely preventable heart and stroke and diabetes related conditions. Note, not yet cancers. I recently quoted an oncologist saying they were seeing a cancer crisis worse than they'd seen before. That, of course, takes a longer time period to start to show itself in terms of death rates. The Telegraph reported today that given how current trends are going, in 2022 the deaths from the effects of lockdowns could be worse than the death figures for COVID. Now, that's an equation that's easy to jump on and misrepresent in black and white terms, and plenty have been doing that. I've drawn attention to the problem here, but as you know, we don't do black and white here if the truth is to be found in shades of grey. So yes, lockdowns were a big factor in all of this, particularly with appointments and treatments that were cancelled as people were encouraged to stay at home and to avoid contact with people as much as humanly possible. And it seems as though the enforced sedentary state of their lives, along with decreases in exercise and increases in drinking, may all have played a part. The question is, how much of this would have happened anyway without formal lockdowns? When I did a video on the effects of lockdown some time ago, I talked then about a study that said that the majority of benefits attributable to lockdowns came from changed behaviour, much of which was achieved with just increased awareness and exhortation. And it's true that, for instance, if you looked at the London Transport passenger figures at the time of the start of the pandemic, the numbers of travellers went down way before the government imposed a formal lockdown. People had already started to behave as though they knew there was a pandemic, because they did. So an open question then is, how much of the backlog and the knock-on harmful effects came as a result of the formal lockdowns, government telling people they must stay at home, not meet with anyone if it could be helped, and how much would have happened anyway because of a way that people naturally change their behaviour in the face of a pandemic. That is hard to tell because only one country in the world did it that way, Sweden, and with a different population density and with a different cultural mindset, there's no guarantee how it would have played out in the UK or elsewhere in that scenario. Even so, the problem was always that the harm from COVID was immediate, the harm from lockdowns was always going to be significantly time delayed. We don't want hype over either one. We want clear analysis. That means we have accurate information to guide such a choice should it come again in the future. Now, my intuition, which I've always been clear about, is that formal lockdowns were very damaging, whereas most of the benefits from behaviour change could have been achieved without them. But that is just a starting proposition, awaiting other, better data than we currently have. The point is, any new pandemic could turn out to be completely different, more lethal than COVID-19. So there's no general rules to be drawn. Never lock down or always lock down. It's about having a clear view of the cost of the trade-offs, trying to make a decision that maximises human benefit and minimises harm. One thing that does seem to be clear is just how disastrous the impact is of closing schools and cancelling exams, which the UK did. The latest cohort of youngsters here got their exam results this week. Many are facing real problems now getting into universities as the rampant grade inflation that came with the cancellation of exams comes to an abrupt end, even while universities are still trying to fulfil promises they made to deferred places for last year's students. A recent study in the Monash Bioethics Review concluded that extended school closures during the pandemic had been, quote, a moral catastrophe, with large harmful effects on children while making little difference to the pandemic. Sweden, of course, did not close its schools, and whatever might or might not be replicable from what they did, the lack of chaos in their school and university situation does stand in stark contrast to what's happening in the UK right now. Now, if you had a pandemic that affected children the most, the opposite of what we actually had, of course that equation would be different. But to know full well that's not your situation and to close schools anyway, that seems to be an act of egregious self-harm, the consequences of which will be felt over decades. And speaking of actions of self-harm, depends on your perspective as to whether you think that's what just happened to US Senator Liz Cheney, or if instead it was an action of heroism. Cheney, who has defined her political objective now as being preventing Donald Trump from getting back into the White House, lost her primary election, as was widely expected. She gave a speech that made the case that she could easily have kept that place in the Senate, but she would have had to sign up for the mythology of the 2020 stolen election, something she wasn't prepared to do. Now, that may be true, although some of the mainstream Republican figures who have not supported the stolen election story, such as Ben Shapiro of the Daily Wire, did suggest a different version. He argued that really she had been punished for pursuing her internally focused campaign at a point when she should have been turning around and fighting the other side, fighting for the Republican Party in the coming election. Now, whatever the truth of it, Cheney is now the keep Trump out at all costs person. She's reportedly considering how to take that forward, possibly including a pitch at the presidency in 2024. Although it's not clear how exactly that's going to work. Ironically, as she does that, the actions of various people trying to put Trump out of contention seems to be making it more and more likely he will stand and possibly that he will win. Since the FBI raid on Mar-a-Lago, millions of dollars are reportedly pouring into the Trump campaign as Republicans see the exercise as a nakedly political attempt to prevent him from standing. Trump's campaign has been maximising the impact by ramping up its email fundraising campaigns, pushing hard the message that these actions are an unprecedented infringement of the rights of every American citizen and a threat to democracy. And the more that happens, the more we're seeing the emergence of exactly the mindset on the other side I've been predicting. In previous episodes, I said that if Trump was the candidate in 2024, we will likely have the American democratic crisis because you'll probably have a situation where neither side will concede defeat. So this week, an interview with Sam Harris went viral, where he very much gave voice to the up-to-now unspoken sentiment that Trump was such a grave aberration from political normality that extraordinary actions are justified in keeping him out. Viral moments included when he colourfully suggested that even if Hunter Biden had had the corpses of children on his laptop, the story still shouldn't have been covered in the 2020 election if it would have served to hand Trump the win. So the media not covering the Hunter Biden story, he said, was justified, even though it was immensely damaging to an organ like the New York Times to be obviously and patently seen to be biased. It was nevertheless better that that happened than Trump should be allowed back into the White House. After the video blew up, he added a few comments to try to clarify his points against some of the commentary that was circulating, and he added this: "Nothing I said on that podcast was meant to suggest that the Democrats would have been right to commit election fraud or take other illegal measures to deny Trump the presidency, nor do I think they did that." Which is fine, but if you watch the full video on the Trigonometry channel, it's relatively clear what was his central proposition. He articulated in full, and really the first time anyone has done so in those terms, the logic that would be used to refuse to accept a Trump victory in 2024. In other words, this is an aberration too far, the damage would be too great, it cannot be allowed to happen. The trouble is, as interviewers Konstantin Kisin and Francis Foster pointed out, it is a patently anti-democratic starting point. Yes, Trump was aberrant because he refused to accept the results of elections if they went against him. If you decide he's so bad that it will justify anti-democratic processes to keep him out, you have effectively conspired with him to do what he could not do alone, which is to actually destroy the democratic foundation of America. As Democrats focus in on all the legal challenges as the FBI pursues its apparent but ill-specified case, they all seem blind to the fact that the actions they're taking make more likely the thing that they fear. Actions create reactions, especially in a country that has already embraced a civil war mentality. And so the Trump campaign can talk about the threat to democracy, and they can, and they no doubt will, point at the Sam Harris interview as a Democrat speaking the quiet part out loud to exactly prove their point and to therefore motivate their base. However, both sides seem to have the potential for self-sabotage right now. In the case of Republicans, Trump's success in getting Senate candidates in place who are loyally signed up to the stolen election story is not being seen as wholly positive by some. From a position where Republicans hope to seize control of both houses, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell now assesses their chances in the Senate in November as only lukewarm. And one of the key factors he attributed to that lower prospect was what he described as candidate quality. Now that'll be good news for some Democrats, those specifically who have stoked controversy by giving support to the Trump-loyal candidates in Republican primaries on the basis that they would be easier to beat. Well, at least their opponents agree with their assessment on the beatability of those candidates. Now, does that justify that sort of wrecking behaviour on the part of one of the major political parties? Well, I guess if you follow the Sam Harris logic of anything goes, or at least anything legal goes, which is what he actually said, then you would say yes. It's not a good look, though. With only the cold comfort that when you look elsewhere in the world, there are even worse looks. So, for instance, in parts of Ukraine now under Russian occupation, attempts are underway to wipe out key aspects of Ukrainian culture. Kherson's occupational government announced back in May that Russia would be mandated as the official language of the region and that it would be launching Russian standards in local schools. But he added that it was having to take actions because many Ukrainian teachers were refusing to accept the required changes. So Kirill Stremusov, the deputy head of the administration, complained like this: "We plan to start the school after May the 10th, but the sabotage of some teachers who crossed the line of adequacy. Everywhere they say they continue to teach according to the Ukrainian curriculum. This is fascism." This statement accompanied the announcement that they would be sending a special group of teachers in to train the local teachers to work according to Russian standards. Some of the teachers would be taken to Crimea to be retrained. Radio Free Europe looks at what has happened in Crimea in the year since it was occupied for clues as to what might be coming next here, and they concluded the area of focus will be on history, literature and language. Educators in Crimea, they said, had been required to teach Russian history, not Ukrainian. Specific historical events such as Stalin's starvation of millions of Ukrainians in the 1930s, those have been erased from the history books. And even the old name for the historic state that gave birth to Ukraine and Russia, Kievan Rus, is being taught as just Rus. With all that documented context, it's therefore not a stretch to believe the Ukrainian Minister for Education and Science, who this week alleged that Russian soldiers are burning books and kidnapping and torturing teachers. Truth is often hard to get in war. You need to scrutinise the claims of both sides sceptically. But even if all the details of this turn out not to be correct, the spirit of it seems wholly in line with what we do know. And the Times of London said it had spoken to Kherson residents who confirmed stories of arrests, threats and torture. Some schools are using underground methods such as using YouTube channels to broadcast the usual Ukrainian school lessons, trying to avoid detection. At the very least, the practical consequences of war are going to leave a lasting scar on the educational chances of this generation of children. 2,500 educational establishments in the country are reported as damaged or completely destroyed. Less than half the 3.6 million school children of Ukraine will be able to return to class next month. A few more if you factor in the 630,000 refugee children who will be studying in other countries. Meanwhile, in these places where a large majority of teachers have to be tortured to get them to teach a Russian curriculum, plans are advanced for a referendum on annexation to Russia to take place on September the 11th. No doubt the referendum will come through resoundingly in favour of the proposition, all entirely fair and above board, obviously. And some people will argue that somehow means something. However, the poison of war does not sadly stop only on one side. Just a month after Russian tennis players were banned from playing at Wimbledon, regardless of their politics, regardless of anything they'd ever said, just on the grounds of their nationality, calls have gone out to ban Russian citizens from travelling within Europe. This was an argument made by Ukrainian President Zelensky. Estonia banned Russians from entering the country. The Czech Republic and Latvia have said that they are supportive of bans as well. And Finland, which has an 830-mile border with Russia, has said that it will severely restrict numbers of Russians able to get visas for entry. No more than 100 a day for tourist visas, for instance. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has pushed back against the call, saying that while Putin's inner circle are being deservedly sanctioned, Europeans need to understand that lots of people were fleeing Russia because they disagreed with the regime. The argument for the other side was put by the Finnish Prime Minister Alexander Stubb. It's a sad state of affairs, but the price of war has to be felt by Russian citizens. The only way in which the hearts and the minds of Russian people can be changed is for them to understand what Putin is doing is a blatant violation of international law. That means a total visa ban on Russians. It's by no means clear where is the body of evidence to support the process of punishing people for things they didn't do as a process of winning hearts and minds, or indeed for isolating them from the rest of the world, isolating them from the news sources that exist in the rest of the world is going to be a way of educating what their local media are determined to keep from them. Just after I'd uploaded last week's news update, the news came through that Salman Rushdie had been attacked in New York. Obviously, it wasn't immediately obvious if he would survive, and as the fulfillment of a threat that had been hanging in the air for nearly 40 years, it was truly shocking. The Rushdie fatwa was the catalytic event that got me first wholly signed up to the importance of free speech in the first place. Interestingly, when it happened, it seemed as though it was the left that naturally embraced free speech as its issue. Possibly because Rushdie was one of their own. Some key politicians on the right, on the other hand, Norman Tebbit, Edwina Currie, they come to mind. They were extremely sniffy about Rushdie. They expressed irritation that he caused such unnecessary offence with his book, moaned about the cost of protecting him from the assassins. I think in Edwina Currie's case, if my memory is correct, it was a long time ago, remember, she joked about how unreadable she thought the book was in the first place. Not being the sort of author that Edwina Currie would read probably did not hurt Rushdie's sales, I'm guessing. Anyway, it's interesting to remember now, when the political right has adopted free speech as its issue, and the political left has opted instead for cancel culture, to the degree where Rushdie himself signed the Harper's letter complaining about cancel culture, a letter that got lots of backlash from the current crop of leftists. Various people have observed that while the state may have, albeit reluctantly, stood by Rushdie when the fatwa first happened, we had clearly lost the battle because, quote, almost certainly the satanic verses would be considered unpublishable today. Offending people at all has gotten various authors cancelled in recent times. Never mind offending the sort of people who will be inclined to turn up with a knife or a gun to seek revenge. It's very, very easy to lose this. I said the Rushdie fatwa was the catalytic event. Well, it was, but it wasn't the first time that I noticed and became concerned. That happened the year before, when I was actually living in Plymouth, it's a coastal city in the UK, and the government had brought in a law that said you couldn't hear the voices of IRA terrorists or those speaking for their cause. So the BBC started telling you what people like Jerry Adams had said, but they voiced it by an actor. It was something of a ridiculous pantomime, the purpose of which you couldn't really work out. That in itself wasn't the problem. But the radio station Plymouth Sound, obviously they couldn't afford the good lawyers. So they were terrified of this law. So they simply refused to allow any discussion on their call-in programme of the IRA, the terrorism campaigns. In principle, they had to prevent anyone from arguing on behalf of the IRA. But they just stopped any and all discussion of the issue, a hugely important current issue of the day. I was astonished and outraged at that. I'd never before come across the chilling effect of censorship that follows poorly defined rules, where people, just to be safe, decide to avoid all mention of something that is actually really relevant and important. You might suggest we now call those things social media community guidelines, for example. We are now surrounded by all of this. In the same week as Rushdie was stabbed, comedian Jerry Sadowitz had his Edinburgh Fringe show cancelled by the venue, the Pleasance Theatre. And the Pleasance Theatre is a staunch defender of free speech. We know this because its director, Anthony Alderson, said so. He said this: the Pleasance is a venue that champions freedom of speech, and we do not censor comedians' material, which is a powerful sentiment, I think you would agree, slightly spoiled by the fact that he then went on to say this: while we acknowledge that Jerry Sadowitz has often been controversial, the material presented at his first show is not acceptable and does not align with our values. This type of material has no place on the festival, and the Pleasance will not be presenting his second and final show. We are now so deep into the dark well of doublespeak that we can say we don't censor someone while announcing the censoring of someone. The usual rule applies. When someone's words and their actions are contradictory, believe the actions first and foremost. So the issue remains as important today as it was when it first solidified before my eyes back in 1989. Maybe in 10 years' time it's back to be seen as an issue championed by the left again and not the right, and people will jump to conclusions about my politics accordingly, as some do already. Hilariously, some assuming one extreme, others assuming the opposite. The point is, it matters particularly when it's not fashionable with your in-group, because that's when you feel the most pressure to abandon it. And when it's abandoned, it mostly serves the interests of dictators and ayatollahs and a bunch of people who have so much less power if only people are allowed to speak the truth. All right. My thanks as always to the people who make it possible for me to make what small contribution I can to the actions of truth-telling here on YouTube. And that is, of course, the people who support this channel on Patreon. Without their support, I could not spend the time that I do making 2 videos per week. I would not have the freedom to go on to any topic that I consider to be important, and regardless of what YouTube may or may not make of it, or indeed what Sam Harris or anybody else may or may not make of it. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.